Lots of people have opinions about what AI will do to jobs and growth. My guest today is the one building a research agenda to find out. Ronnie Chatterji is the chief economist at OpenAI and one of the pioneers of the economics of AI. We get into what AI means today and what that means for workers and policy. Here's our talk. Welcome to the Economics of Work. I'm excited to welcome Ronnie Chatterji, chief economist at OpenAI. Maybe you've heard of it. Ronnie, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Ben. It's exciting to be here.
For sure. So you've got the coolest job in the world, I think. How do you set a research agenda for a company like OpenAI? How do you decide what not to work on?
It's a great question, and I really do agree that I have the coolest job in the world. I recently wrote my first Substack post out of a series that we're coming out with that said I think I have the
like
coolest
it,
job.
by the way, and
No,
welcome to Substack. Better than Twitter.
Thank you. No, I enjoy
Yeah.
the long form part of it. It's also why I enjoy the podcast, and I did describe it as the coolest job in the world. And I don't know if it'd be true for everybody, but for people like you and I who are economists interested in new technologies and how they impact society and the economy as a whole, I couldn't think of a cooler job in the world. And one of the biggest challenges in the job is setting a research agenda. And so when I started this job about 2 years ago, there really wasn't a playbook in an AI lab for a chief economist. I was the first one. There were chief economists at other tech companies, though, and I sought them out. I asked them how they prioritize, how they built their team, what
Who
became
did you
really
talk to?
important. I talked to everyone from Susan Athey to folks who had worked at Google, people like Jed Kolko, who'd done stuff at Indeed,
Yeah.
and just a great network of folks across many, many different companies. I also, when I had been chief economist of the Commerce Department in a different kind of role inside government, I talked to a lot of chief economists at banks and manufacturing firms. And so I had a little bit of sense of how we might set this up. But a lot of it was new, Ben. I mean, just being in the middle of this AI revolution, a lot of the assumptions that might have guided my thinking in the past went out the window, and I needed to kind of rewrite the script in terms of what we were doing. I'll tell you a couple of things that guided me. I mean, one was, what are the questions I'm getting asked? I mean, as an economist, I really believe that some of the best research questions and getting a sense of the vibes come from reading the newspaper and thinking about what people are talking about on the front pages of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the Economist magazine. These are some of the biggest issues. I also think you can do a straw poll at your kid's soccer game or,
Yeah.
and see what people are asking you about. And I realized early on, people were going to ask me about questions around labor, which I know you've made a lot of big contributions, as has Revelio. And they were going to ask me about economic growth and living standards and how AI would affect that. So we organized one part of our group to really focus on jobs and growth because we knew we were going to get a lot of questions around that.
Jobs and growth in the same unit. So those are linked together. Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you
Cool.
can think about dividing them, but honestly, a lot of the skill sets that were useful in sort of the indicators that are being tracked and the stakeholders who are interested in, you got to think about this in terms of audience. They kind of traverse the macro micro divide in a way that might be surprising, but I agree it was a counterintuitive way maybe to put them together. The second bucket was
No,
really
I like it, by the way. I feel
Yeah.
like a lot of people are separating those, and you have people who opine on productivity who are sort of different than people who talk about labor market implications, but I like that they're linked. But anyway, go on. Yeah.
But it's a very astute point because I think you, as an economist who does this kind of work, you know that these two things could be separated. I think for a lot of other folks, when you say, if you work in government, they say, what does an economist do? You tell me about the job numbers and you tell me about GDP. And you and I know those
Yeah.
are two very different things, but we put them together for the reasons that I think the audiences care about these things. And a lot of the folks asking those questions, right, they're asking both of those. The second bucket, I think, definitely reflects some of my training background and bias, which is I care a lot about enterprise. I think a lot about previous technological waves, and what made them really stick and have an impact on productivity was how organizations adopted them. People who know me well, know my background, won't be surprised to hear that. I've taught in a business school for a long time. I care a lot about organizations. A lot of my own research is around organizations adopting new innovations and how entrepreneurs launch new organizations around innovation. And so I thought, look, we really got to be focused on enterprise. And I thought that there was also an important audience out there, different somewhat from the folks asking the questions about jobs and growth, although some overlap. And that was really going to be enterprise customers who are interested in, how do I build my company around AI? What do I do as a manager? And as a business school professor, I felt very comfortable with that group, and I felt like I could really make an impact with cutting edge research in that area. So that was sort of the second bucket of work. And the third one was sort of almost everything else in what you might call the AGI economics theme. There are so many interesting topics that are somewhat exclusive to AI that don't neatly fit into the other two, but they certainly intersect with it. And I'll just give you one example, a topic like recursive self-improvement. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about where that fits, the ability of AI models to improve themselves, or maybe at the least AI complementing AI researchers to build new and more advanced capabilities. That could affect the job market and growth. It could affect enterprises, but it's sort of, given the state of where things are, belongs in its own category. And I wanted to give a space where we could speak to some of the more sort of forward-looking and novel applications of AI, contemporary issues in AI, to make sure that our group wasn't sort of straitjacketed by the old paradigm. So those are sort of the three ways we've organized it and how I prioritize my research agenda. Anything that doesn't fit into those things, we keep a list, we discuss it, we revisit it, but just given resourcing, bandwidth, even my ability to sort of manage all these different areas, we try to make tough decisions about what to prioritize. And I think we've done the best we can, and we really draw on others who are doing research in areas that we don't cover as much. That's the way we solve that.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. So do you have kind of a time frame in mind? Like when I think of RSI, I think, oh, we're talking like bunch of years out. But when we talk about jobs and labor, maybe that's more short term. If we talk about like how businesses reconfigure themselves, maybe that's more medium term. Like how do you think about like what is the time frame in which you're trying to understand the effects of all this?
This is where it's different being in a lab versus being in academia, where, a lot of the work I did in academia looked at data sets that were, large panel data sets over sort of long periods of years, but it was in the past, and even the recent past. Maybe I'd be looking at a data set that was 3 or 4 years old. Your organizations produce data sets that are more real time, but for most of us, we were looking at things a little bit in the near past. In this type of organization, I think you got to do a mix of real time work, speaking to what's actually happening, let's say in the job market. Today, we released a great paper in a series called Work at the Frontier by my labor economist team of Alex Richmond and Caroline Chin. That team is basically finding that people are adding new tasks at work. What's happening with AI isn't that your job's being eliminated because AI can do parts of it. It's more like workers are adding new tasks to their job and redesigning work. And so that kind of work, which I think is in short supply in a lot of the AI economics
Yeah.
discussions, if I may, is really important for saying what's happening in the job market now. With enterprise, it might be saying, look, here's this new amazing product called Codex. We recently released a paper and a blog post on Codex that a lot of people are talking about. And the reason they're talking about it is probably because we contrasted OpenAI's usage with the rest of enterprise. And what you see is OpenAI is completely sort of on sort of Codex and the agentic AI path right now. If you look at the percent of tokens produced by Codex, other organizations are slowly increasing that and will over time, but they're moving more slowly than, let's say, OpenAI would in adopting its own agentic tools. That's something for the 3 to 6 months, maybe a year out, depending on the organizations and industry. I want managers to look at the paper and more likely the blog post and say, okay, here are some patterns at OpenAI. It took about 4 or 5 months for marketing, sales, finance, some of the functions in a business to catch up with research and engineering to the extent they were using agentic tools. That might give a CEO or CTO or CIO some guidance in terms of how long it might take in their own organization. And then I think about RSI and topics in the last bucket further out, although we're starting to see some really interesting patterns in that direction. That's something to think more in terms of scenario planning over the longer haul to understand how we prepare for what comes next. And frankly, given how capabilities have moved so fast, even with a topic like RSI, you have to be really prepared for what's happening now and present some of that evidence. So it kind of blends in there as well. That's how
Yeah.
I divide it. And you kind of have to multitask in a job like this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you don't want to be late to that. Um,
No.
yeah, I mean, so much to unpack there. One thing I really want to like congratulate you on is this idea of like measuring the introduction of new tasks and like so we just came out with something. It's going to be published tomorrow. By the time this comes out, it'll be out. But it's looking at like how much the total stock of work activities is shifting. And it's like really shifting much more dramatically in the most recent past than it was in the last year or so. But that is still primarily happening within occupations, not between occupations. So out of the total like workforce transformation, it's like 93% within occupations. And
Yes.
really it's like kind of intuitive when you say it, but most economists look at, changes in the occupation shares. So, they talk about like automation of jobs rather than like automation within a job.
Oh, it's very we're on the same wavelength then in terms of, and this is why I think it's great that sort of empirical economists are tackling these issues. When I think we first started to look at AI and measure the capabilities, there was a lot of sort of, mapping the capabilities to exposure to a job to some sort of outcome in the labor market. And people like you and I who've been studying this from different angles, working in government, working in enterprise, working with the data, realize that that loop or that spiral is a little more complicated. And that's been true going back to the internet and even before that. And we read that work, we learned from the people who wrote those papers. I think when we looked at AI exposure here, we come up with a much more nuanced model. Like, again, our labor economics team, led by Alex Richmond, did a nice piece a few months ago that really divided jobs into 4 different categories. Some jobs, a smaller percentage that would be directly affected by AI and possibly more at risk of automation, but a whole set of jobs that would likely be reorganized around new tasks, the kind of thing that you might be finding, as well as jobs that might expand once the price of delivering a service goes down and demand grows, sort of like the downward sloping demand curve or Javon's paradox, however you call it. And what I thought was interesting here is this is pretty basic economic insight that Alex applied to do this, but it really helped us understand the job market in a new way. And the reason it made a splash, I think, is because we're hearing a lot about exposure without a lot of context. And I think studies like yours are probably very much in that direction, giving people an idea of what's going on underneath the hood, where it's showing up, where it's not showing up, and why. And that's a big part of what I think our jobs are at OpenAI.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess when I think about exposure, I think the most useful kind of application of exposure is just kind of illustrating that there's a lot that's exposed. This is a general purpose technology. And like you said, it's hard to think about how this gets embedded into business processes. You need the technological innovation paired with the business process innovation. So based on what you and your team observe, like how is that going? Like are businesses adapting to this new paradigm? Are they building out new business processes? Like how should we understand like what new processes these things are enabling?
Well, yeah, I think this is why enterprise research is so important. So, Ben, when we started talking about
Yeah,
the labor market, I came into a world where people were talking a lot about exposure, but I felt like just the same way you mentioned that, like, occupations within occupation shifts, across occupation shifts are important to look at. I started to think about the firm. Jobs exist mostly in organizations, right? Either you found a new organization in more rare instances or you work in an organization. And a lot of the exposure work wasn't really contextualized in the organization. So I
interesting.
said, this is why we need to set up an enterprise research stream inside OpenAI. And so what we've done, we just presented the results of a paper last week with my co-authors at OpenAI and some external scholars, David Holtz, Sunny Tambay from Columbia Business School and Wharton, respectively. Great group of
Good
scholars
crew.
on that
Yeah.
paper. Yeah. And they're finding that basically looking at all of our enterprise customers, you're seeing sort of the larger firms, the ones with higher R&D, SG&A stocks, higher revenue for employee adopting AI. And what they're able to do on the enterprise level is look at the composition of which employees, which I think is another interesting twist. I think a lot about what can my data do that, others won't be able to do? What projects should I work on that, only we can do? Looking inside the org and finding that, look, the more senior someone is in the organization, they're going to adopt it more broadly, but conditional on adoption, younger team members inside the organization, more junior ones, are using it much more. And this allows us to get some texture inside the organization that it's not just all about exposure. It depends about role, it depends about seniority, depends what kind of industry and firm context you're in. And that's where I think we need to get more deep in terms of understanding how AI flows through the organization.
Yeah.
For our team, our theory of the case is if we understand the enterprise context, we're going to have more texture to understand what's happening in the job market, where a lot of it isn't going to be straight exposure leading to some disruption. It'll likely mean the way we do our jobs is changing in many professions, and some new opportunities will be created that we never would have imagined.
I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that I've been sort of grappling with a little bit where, I used to think of AI as this sort of seniority biased technological change where, you think of a job as a collection of tasks, but like you're executing on those tasks and you're also coordinating between those tasks. And more senior people who have experience managing, coordinating, orchestrating, they are better at orchestrating things, whereas younger people have more of a comparative advantage in execution, which is something that AI was better at. Now it seems like, I mean, you brought this up earlier, that when we used to say AI, we meant chatbots. And now when we say AI, we mean agentic systems, which are complicated and like complicated for someone who's not like digitally native. And maybe that's not as seniority biased in the same way. I mean, how should we think about like just this sort of new identity of AI in a way? I mean, is that a real thing? And does it change the way we should think about what types of groups are the most intensive users, more complementary? How should we think about all that?
then it is a real thing. And honestly, just the enthusiasm and curiosity you have is just I reflect and resonate with it in the same way. And it's what makes this job and this whole thing we're doing so interesting. So you're right. The early work on AI and even reflected in some of my own experience, it seemed like the way we're using chatbots was a complement to existing expertise. I always tell people the story how, I fly cross country to California, more often than you'd expect, or more
Yeah,
often
yeah.
maybe than
Sorry
I
to hear
wish.
it.
But on those flights, I end up, talking to ChatGPT a lot about economics, and I always felt that my ability to ask the right questions in the chatbot interface, the ability to know what I was looking for, to kind of spot where maybe there was a weakness in the reasoning, or something wasn't as deep as it should be, really helped me get the most out of it. And I think about my kids or someone who hasn't yet taken economics 101. I always thought, look, it's not going to be as useful for them in those deep explorations, and I just felt I got so much more out of it in a way that a senior partner at a law firm, a private equity firm, an investment bank, a tech firm would be able to use their judgment and experience as a match for what AI could provide. And I think a lot of the sort of early work, canaries in the coal mine and other papers, sort of were finding this idea or some evidence that, hey, maybe this was going to affect early career workers different than seniors. What we're finding though now is in the work that we're doing is conditional on adoption, at least. Younger team members, more junior ones, are using it more because a lot of that earlier work hadn't really contextualized this inside an organization where we actually have the roles, where we know the seniority, where we know the function. And so some of this evidence is now pointing to a countervailing force, and we don't know how they're going to balance out. But younger people or less tenured people, they might be more tech savvy. We can see this in our organizations. I work with a bunch of folks who are much younger than me, and they are often the ones who are bringing new applications, much more sort of deft with the technology. They're teaching me things. And maybe another time we should talk more about the reverse mentoring and how valuable that is for somebody like me. But what I
Yeah.
do see is they're tech savvy with the combination of agentic tools that can go, if not end to end, at least middle to middle, allow them to overcome some of sort of the benefits that I would have from experience. And so now I see that as a countervailing force in a way we should really watch. And I think it's just a lesson for all of us. Some of that early evidence and our intuition may have suggested disparate effects, early career versus later career. We got to keep studying that and understand it. Some of this newer stuff I'm seeing with agents might be working in a different direction. And I'm excited to see how that works. And it just shows you we're going to continue to have to look at this carefully, do high quality research with rigor, right? Get credible sort of peer review on it and make sure we understand what's going on. And, that will hopefully happen at a really brisk pace compared to previous technological revolutions where I know people are today very impatient for that evidence, and we're trying our best.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're in the same boat. We had results that were very similar to the Canaries results, and then we recently did a collaboration with Ramp where we found that the firms that were adopting the most were actually growing even in younger workers. So it does seem like there's a meaningful shift.
This is why we do research. And I think
Yeah,
I look back at a lot of the early, if people are interested in the historical example, you might go back and look at the early work on the economics of the internet. Look what was being published in 1998 and 1999, and contrast that with 2002, 2003. Maybe I have the dates a little bit wrong, but look at the early sort of research in this area and see what they were studying, see the results they were finding, and that might give you a good sense of like the value of research at different parts of the technology life cycle. I'm still a big believer that it's important to study these things as they're moving. I think some people, the attitude might be something like throw their hands up and say, well, things are moving so fast. What's the point of studying it? That's not
yeah.
the point of view I have. I actually think it's really worthwhile to study things even as they're changing because we do need some evidence out there. And, with organizations like yours, a fast moving lab like ours, we can do much, much more faster turnarounds than let's say we could do traditionally with the data we have. So I'm interested in continuing to do this work, even though the technology outpaces the insight as much as we can,
Yeah,
control.
totally. I mean, better be first and half right than
Yeah,
last and fully right.
exactly.
I want to ask a little bit about like what's happening within the labs and the belly of the beast. So, I know OpenAI has had in its charter, the idea of being able to outperform humans at, economically valuable tasks. And most economically, I forget the exact terminology, but it's something that specifically makes it sound like it's about human substitution. And I think that has made people nervous because, they say, oh, well, maybe it matters who's doing the work. Maybe if people in Silicon Valley just kind of want to replace humans, maybe we won't get technology that complements human labor. And so yeah, I guess I want to ask you like, what are the vibes inside of OpenAI? Like, is the goal to create AGI that, eclipses human beings at things? Or is it more to complement human labor? Are things shifting? Does it even matter? I mean, are we just going to see how this technology manifests and it'll just kind of take on a life of its own? I mean, how do you think through all that?
I think I reflect back on the day I joined OpenAI. I went to an onboarding session and it was unlike any orientation I'd ever been to. A guy named Josh Ockham, who longtime employee of OpenAI, gave a speech about sort of the mission. And I had onboarded into government, university, my first job out of school in finance, and I'd seen a lot of orientation presentations and discussions about mission. And mission is really important in a lot of kinds of organizations. But I always kind of have my antenna up to see, like, how much does this really matter at this new place I'm at? And the talk
Yeah.
he gave about building AGI to benefit all of humanity was like nothing I'd ever seen. That last part, building AGI to benefit all of humanity, is really, really important. And so when he said this and gave such a compelling explanation for why he was working on these things and how it manifests in different things that he had seen, I started to think, okay, I'm going to keep an eye out and I'm going to see if this is the only person who's talking like this or if there's lots of others.
Yeah.
And while Josh was is and was at that point like a very effective sort of communicator and ambassador for this work, I found it was actually really widely shared. And that isn't to mean that we always get it right or everyone agrees. It's more like, if I could measure in our Slack messages how often the mission is mentioned or reflected on, I think you'd be surprised by the incidence of that and how often it happens. And I think I was certainly surprised, having worked in a lot of mission-driven organizations. And so there's a lot of effort to say, okay, how does this reflect on the mission? How does it align with the mission? I'll just give you one example. I think the whole idea about our large free user base is something that obviously a lot of people are very interested in, but it's very important to the mission because we really believe that we want to democratize intelligence. This is something that should be spread widely so people can use it. And that goes to something as fundamental as the business model of OpenAI. So I think one piece I'll say is the mission remains really important. The benefits all humanity piece is also really key. I think you're right to frame this and say, look, if AI is more capable at these tasks, let's say, than a human worker doing the equivalent task, I should say, then if you have like a GDP val, which I know you're familiar with, and you look at how sort of machines
Yeah.
perform compared to humans, you could measure these kinds of things. But what's left unsaid in these kinds of discussions is there's a lot of new work that gets created and new work around AI. So to me, the substitution framing is not implicit in how we're thinking about this. In fact, like, this from the labor economics work, there's a lot of evidence in economics that we tend to create lots of new work over time, right? The old story of new job descriptions that we didn't even have, just 25 years ago or 10 years ago. So I think that's the piece that kind of squares the circle for me and makes me, in the end, really bullish on humans and what they're able to do. I do think also as AI capabilities advance, there is a little bit of a lag and some frictions inside organizations as people unlock those capabilities. That's also opportunity in the job market, and it sometimes can last longer than people think.
Yeah, two thoughts here. I mean, one is that, one thing that I always get uncomfortable about is when people talk about the jagged frontier.
Mhm.
Because I think the implicit assumption behind the jagged frontier is that AI is better than humans at some things, but like there's still some things where AI is like kind of incomplete. And where the presumed goal is to kind of round out the jagged frontier and like get better at humans. But, as an economist, I kind of think the more jagged the better. Bring it on. Like double down on your strengths and like, that's like benefit from comparative advantage. I feel like that idea of kind of rounding out the jagged frontier is still kind of like an unsaid goal. I mean, do you think that's still kind of the goal in Silicon Valley?
I think actually the goal for our educational institutions, for how we think about developing our kids, whenever people ask me about this, I think about sort of complementing this amazing capability with AI, in some ways filling in that jagged frontier with human ingenuity and things that only we can do, right? That's at least the way I think
Yeah.
about it. So people say, wow, what should your kids study in school? First of all, I'm not willing to write off STEM just because AI is really good at coding. I think people learn STEM for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with the job they're going to do. A way of thinking, a way of approaching problems, understanding the world. I think we've kind of sort
Yeah,
of
I agree.
vacillated back and forth where, 10 years ago, there was, lots of pushes to require coding for every kindergartner. And now we're saying it's completely useless. Neither of those, I think, really capture why we study science, technology, engineering, and math. And I think it's as true today as it was before that we should learn those subjects because of the rigor they introduce in how we think, as well as philosophy and related topics that teach that kind of rigorous thinking. At the same time, humanities has often sort of been, as STEM has been ascended, maybe people have overlooked it. This is a great time to emphasize humanities because humanities is what makes us human, right? And so if you think
Yeah.
about this, right, judgment, decision making, leadership, being able to persuade, understanding how to connect to people and cultures and make change at the systemic level is going to be a human occupation. And that's really what the alignment sort of agenda is all about, making sure we build this technology in a way that's compatible with human goals. And so I think that humanity piece is going to be important. And so when I think of the future of education, there's a lot of uncertainty, no doubt, but there's also a lot of excitement and room for experimentation to teach both humanities and STEM. And to the extent there was ever a formula before, I'm not sure there was. We're probably building a new
Yeah.
kind of formula, and figuring that out is going to be a really interesting challenge for educational institutions, but a really great opportunity for kids who are figuring out what to do as well. So that's at least the way I see it. It's not going to be easy, but it is, I think, really important and interesting work.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, I think when it comes to education, I'm more nervous about higher ed. Like, I think, elementary school, everything's kind of in person, but like in higher ed, I mean, we both teach at business schools, the MO was basically, you give assignments and you grade how they do. And now you can't really do that anymore. I mean, everyone's assignments are going to come back perfect. And and it's because like students are incentivized to just like demonstrate, high quality work, and they haven't really emphasized learning and like developing the real skills. And I feel like, we're kind of like at a moment where the weaknesses in higher ed are becoming maybe more obvious. I don't know. Do you have thoughts on like what is happening to higher ed, if something needs to change, or, if
Mhm.
you're like not nervous? I don't know. Any thoughts on higher ed?
I definitely think higher ed will need to change. It probably depends on the kind of context, what type of students you're teaching. I'll start just with like business school students and MBA students, which is a very particular
Yes.
population, professional degree. And I recognize that's sort of a limited context, but it's the one I built my majority of my teaching career and almost really all of my teaching career. So when I think about MBA students, I think about two things. It's a professional degree for students who are a little bit out of undergrad, tend to be older, let's say between 26 and 32 years old on average, right? For me, if I'm preparing them for the workforce, I really need to make sure that I'm using the tools they're going to use at work. So if their top jobs are in
Right.
consulting or tech or finance, I can't really, unless there's a really good reason, a skill that they must learn to do by hand before they can use, sort of the computer or AI. I think including AI in that curriculum for the kinds of classes I teach, very, very important. So when I think about this, I think, okay, I have to use AI. Then I think about the issue of, okay, but I also have to, in addition to preparing them for the workforce, I have to assess them so we can differentiate between
Right.
which students are putting in the work and have the skills. What does assessment look like in an era where people can return perfect assignments? And so we are going to have to change the way, and I think we're already changing the way we assess students. And so as a professor, one of the hardest things to do when you're preparing class that you've taught a bunch of times is change everything. And I am very
Yeah.
sympathetic to that, and I understand the frustration. But I find myself using much more of the Socratic method or asking for oral presentations. And, if I were to go back and teach now, reflecting on my experience at OpenAI, I would tell the students, look, I report to the chief financial officer. I can send her the most perfect document. But in the end, we're going to have a weekly one-on-one, and she's going to ask me what I think. And if I haven't ingested what I've sent her, if I don't understand it, if I can't answer questions around it, I'm not going to be around very long.
Right.
And I think that hopefully should give students both the motivation to learn what they're doing as they're using sort of tools, AI tools to complement it. And also, I'll build that into my assessment as if they're going to present to their boss. I think that's the kind of changes I see in the business school environment. I think probably as you move to younger students, particularly like in high school and things like that, then we need much harder restrictions on how AI is used in the classroom and pedagogy. College, it depends, I think, a little bit on the class. I have less experience teaching there. So, with my own
Yeah.
kids being secondary school and now like having taught MBAs, those areas I have the strongest opinions. I do think higher ed will have to change. I also think it's changed a lot in many ways. Being a professor myself, knowing a lot of professors who have been around for a long time, they've adjusted in lots of ways before. And I think, there's a lot of diversity among educational institutions, let's say in the United States and surely around the world. So I think there's a lot of room for experimentation. So I'm excited to see what they come up with. And I think some are going to find great ways to do it. And you can spread best practices to the ones who maybe have done it in a different way.
Going back to this idea of kind of like benefiting all of humanity. How do we know like, there's a few ways that can happen. Like, do you think the benefits of AI on humanity are going to happen primarily through kind of like the consumer surplus they get through non-work? Or do you think it's going to primarily happen through the channel of work?
I think at the beginning, it's got to be consumer surplus. What you're seeing with the massive consumer adoption of, let's say, ChatGPT, over 900 million weekly active users, what value is that creating? It's not going to show up in productivity statistics yet. It's going to show up as consumer surplus. And you said it exactly right, right? Me basically using this to make decisions in my life, to solve logistical challenges, do things around the house. It saves me a ton of time that'll never show up in any traditional economic indicator.
Yeah.
And interestingly, when that goes to different markets outside the US, let's say, where where the quality of a commensurate good and service. Look at the healthcare you might get between sort of a richer country and a lower income country. I think the gap between the intelligence you're going to get is actually going to be much narrower, which means the welfare gains are going to be larger, right? In some sense, as you think about this. And so as I think about when we have Avi Kallis on our who's working with our team to
Oh yeah.
develop an alternative measure of GDP called GDPB, or working on work he's built on with
Oh,
Eric
with Eric
Brynjolfsson.
Brynjolfsson, yeah.
Exactly. And basically try to quantify this both for sort of, markets like the US and other markets. So I think actually the consumer surplus will be a big channel. And then over time, as we build firms, as we make them more productive, that's going to show up in the more traditional indicators and lead to productivity growth, GDP growth, and, sort of raising the standard of living. So that's kind of how I think of it happening now. We are seeing some of those consumer surplus indicators. And what we do, the productivity statistics will follow that.
Yeah. Do you think you can tell, what are the really high value consumer uses? I mean, I guess with consumer, it's hard to say like what's high value because like it's sort of subjective.
But
But
revealed preference. I mean, like, what do people do, right? I think, we
yeah.
wrote a paper on this, how people use ChatGPT. And again, like, at the time we did it, it wasn't clear that writing these papers and going through like academic, channels was the right thing. We really made a bet on that and said, look, we're going to do things this way. And that paper basically shows that, if you talk about like the three different kinds of like use cases, like what's the intent behind them? Like the intent tends to be asking, doing, and expressing. And so we categorize sort of how people were sort of using sort of their ChatGPT sessions and, what kinds of things are they doing when they're asking or doing, right? With asking, it's often something like seeking information, and traditional web search is a way to think through this. And so that's one really popular use case circa 2025, at least 2025. The other one is writing. And, whenever I thought about this in terms of doing, and people said, wow, I'm looking for more cutting edge agentic use cases. What do you mean writing? And I just think, taking a step back, think about how much writing we do, in our personal lives and even at work, where writing is the foundation of most white collar work, right? And the fact that we're using AI for writing is a really important indicator to me. I think people get a lot of value out of it. I think about parents like mine who may come from another country who, for them, being able to sort of write in English, let's say, in a different way or improve their writing could be a game changer. I think that's true for people who are coming from other countries, new to this country, new to a language across the world. That's a big, big productivity unlock as well. So I think the writing piece is a key on the doing side, seeking information, a really big important thing on the asking.
And are there uses that you see or maybe don't see that you think are just like not widely used yet, but you're just like super bullish on in the future?
I think
Like
on the
like what's the most
ones,
underrated use?
yeah, I'll say the thing you see the most that people don't talk enough about is learning. I mean, if you think about sort of young
Yeah.
people using ChatGPT to learn new stuff is just so prominent, and it's a big reason people come to use AI is to learn about things they don't know. And to me, like you might quibble with the method or what they're learning about or whatever, but I just see tremendous opportunity to learn new stuff. And I agree, the more expertise you have, sometimes you know what questions to ask, but it's just fun to see people using it for this. And I had learned so much using like ChatGPT and Codex and other products over the years. I think the underrated use case that I see, we released a report in May on entrepreneurship. One of the things I think that's really important is
Yeah.
to understand how AI facilitates entrepreneurship. A lot of my background is writing these kind of papers on the entrepreneurial process. So I want to know how AI affects entrepreneurship. And we released a short report on that and are working on a lot more in that area. And, we looked at kind of what entrepreneurs are doing in America with ChatGPT. And we found that they were doing a lot of marketing and copywriting, legal and compliance, branding, identity, customer comms, really interesting use cases to become, in the words of Ed Lazier, who studied entrepreneurship, jack of all trades, right? Or Jill of all trades. And the idea there is like an entrepreneur, she might not be able to afford to hire a marketing consultant or a copywriter or a lawyer herself when she's first getting started. But this kind of unlocks the ability to bring those capabilities in-house and develop those things. And maybe it increases demand down the road for more sophisticated use cases. So I think entrepreneurship, big underrated use case. You see a lot of ideation and sort of entrepreneurial process steps on ChatGPT as something that we're going to be pushing on a lot in the team going forward.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I mean, I think it's so useful. I think, if this were around when I started Revelio, like we could have just done things so much more easily. I mean, I saw, Ernie Tedeschi at Stripe wrote a piece on solo entrepreneurship and how it's rising, presumably due to AI. It seems to be like a real trend based on what you see. Like, how much of an economically meaningful effect is there on the rise of entrepreneurship and like small teams?
I think there's a couple of working papers right now that are under review where we'll see kind of the causal impact of, let's say, AI on the rise in entrepreneurship. So it's an interesting topic to look at. Ours is descriptive, and I think that's what we can do with the data we have. And I try to be very hard not to overclaim based on the data we have out of the econ research team. So there we say, here's what people are doing with it. I think that a lot of the studies I've seen are trying to get sort of better identification on this question and sort of definitively answer it. What I think is also interesting, though, is as important as the number of new business starts. Obviously, every policymaker, enterprise reporter cares about that. Entrepreneurial process is also about deciding not to become an entrepreneur, and that might be a little bit
Yeah.
counterintuitive. But some people are cut out to be a founder and do something new, and some people need to iterate on an idea and figure out, you know what, this isn't the one for me. I'm better off in my existing job, or maybe I can pursue this as part of an existing organization. And those joiners are actually much larger number than founders and can be really economically impactful. Most of us are joiners, not founders. When I tell someone I work at OpenAI, I think they're really happy that I joined, even though I wasn't the founder, right? Maybe
Yeah.
you could argue, different angles on that, but like it's still
Yeah.
wonderful to work there in an organization that other people founded. So I sort of feel like ChatGPT and using AI can be useful both for starting and launching a firm, but also iterating ideas and figuring out whether you want to go for it. And that might improve selection into the entrepreneurial funnel and lead to more successful enterprises. That's kind of an angle I'm interested in. So we'll watch to see as this
Yes.
cool causal evidence comes out, and you're seeing some contemporaneous rise in solo businesses. But we'll wait for these articles to kind of make it through the review process and see what we can establish.
Yeah, interesting. I really like this framing that, the more people have access to like at least evaluating their idea, then you can get better matches. You have sort of like a thicker market for
Exactly.
like the startup to be and the entrepreneurs who could join them. Do you think that AI does something to kind of the optimal mix of like very small and medium and large companies? Like if we just think about like the theory of the firm, like
Yes.
in this new paradigm with like very intelligent AI, is it more optimal to have a lot of small firms or big mega firms? Like, does that change in your mind?
I think it's an open question, one of the most exciting ones that, we're focused on as well. I think I see two bits. It's a little bit like the countervailing forces you mentioned before on the early career versus like the more senior roles. On one hand, I mean, the phenomenon we're talking about here, where if you started Revelio today, you could do a lot of things that someone said, oh, you'll have to hire a specialist for that, and it would be expensive for you. And so maybe you did not utilize like certain services at the beginning. You're like, hey, I can't really do any comms because I don't know how to do it and I can't afford to do it. And that might have, stunted the growth of Revelio early on until you could hire someone. I think what's interesting is now you can do some of that stuff yourself and get to a certain level. So in some ways, smaller firms, right, might be more prevalent as people can do more of this stuff on their own. I do think though we're then holding sort of the market fixed in a way that probably isn't true, right? Once you could do more, people might want more from you, right? And then they might demand more of your services, and you say, "Gosh, now I got to hire some more salespeople, right? Or I need to hire a marketing
Yeah.
person who can differentiate me from all these other people who are using AI." So that wedge is something interesting to watch. I also think there's this story that we sometimes tell students in business school that like it's always small firms who introduce new technologies, they inevitably disrupt the incumbents. I think there's lots of kind of technologies that are not necessarily disruptive but sustaining technologies where large firms can actually utilize them more effectively. And so that's the thing to watch going forward is will larger firms, utilizing more data, the ability to have sort of more tight governance and control, maybe training employees at a higher rate than a small business could. Are they going to be able to see the gains of AI more so, let's say, than small firms? I think it's a really important question. People focus a lot on the ability to start and the competitive elements of entrepreneurship, but they don't think as much about sort of larger firms' ability to leverage AI. And I think that's an important chapter we have to think about in any book writing about AI in the enterprise.
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, if you're like using AI at a large firm, how do you know if you are using it well?
I
I mean,
think,
yeah, how do you
yeah.
go about like that question? I mean, I feel like every executive is saying like, "Oh yeah, we are like AI, we have an AI first strategy." And it's like in a lot of cases like vague nonsense.
It's a good point. So we
Yes.
released a report that we now do quarterly called B2B signals. One thing when I started the job is people said, look,
Yeah.
Ronnie, don't go in there and just do this work and not, make the data available to as many people as you can. And as an economist who worked on the outside with a lot of enterprises to do studies, I said, okay, I'm going to really try, but I know it's hard, right? So we released our signals data set, which basically allows people to download all the consumer data and trends around the world. And that's the kind of data we used in our ChatGPT paper from last year. We also did the same thing for enterprise in B2B signals. And we find a lot of inbound from enterprises and really C-suite leaders who are saying, okay, how do I benchmark my company against what you're finding in B2B signals. And when I give talks on this, I just tell them, hey, look, you can point Codex to the enterprise data, to the B2B data, and you could create a slide for your board presentation, and just like that. And as we keep iterating and adding more data, here's a couple things I think stand out. One is most organizations have power users who are using a lot more compute. They're doing more advanced use cases, right? They're more likely to be doing things around coding and consuming or I would say utilizing token intensive workflows. There's a whole set of people in the middle, the median users who are still using AI like a chatbot in most enterprises. And the challenge is trying to help these early adopter lead users translate what they do into helping people at the median increase their use of AI to do more productive things at work. A lot of that comes down to role-specific use cases. Even for myself, and I work at OpenAI, it wasn't until people showed me the ways I could use agentic tools for my role as chief economist that I really unlocked a lot of the potential. And I feel that'd be the same thing for a lot of people around different organizations. The challenge is every time we drop a new model, our evidence shows that the power users, they pull away. They're doing even more. They're consuming more tokens, doing more use cases, using more agentic tools. And so there's both, and you'll appreciate this, Ben, is like the extensive margin and the intensive margin. And I feel like, last year, 2025 was the year of the extensive margin, trying to think about how many people are adopting AI or even having a binary 0 or 1 with firms. I do think in 2026 and beyond, it's the intensive margin, which is how deeply are you adopting it? And that's what enterprises all the way up to the C-suite need to be measuring.
Yeah, interesting. That does kind of seem right. I mean, you've got sort of like saturation on how extensive this can become, like really fast. So just on the signals data, just for researchers who may be listening, what's the pitch? Like what's in the data? What do you think? What are the promises of what can be done, in economic research with that data?
Well, the great news is you can look at how use of AI differs across geography, differs across language, all sorts of different cuts of the data. And we recently launched a program called Exchange where scholars, researchers sent us proposals. And what's really interesting is a lot of the proposals really were asking for the same things. And I was able to go back and say, hey, this is already in Signals, or it helped inform that we can basically release that in future editions of Signals. And so I think check out the webpage, see if you think it's interesting and if data is useful. You can always contact the team. Obviously, we can't provide everything that people ask for, but we try our best to provide that data. And one of the reasons we put it up there is that I think the most interesting things are the geographic cuts. We're going to do a refresh of Signals this week and release some new data on some geographies that are growing really fast. And having been to 12 different countries since I started OpenAI, it's really interesting to see how some countries are growing really fast right now. And, it started obviously very prevalent in sort of richer countries, but now you see a wider diversity of countries that are adopting AI and really sort of, increasing their share. And that is like probably one of the biggest stories that people aren't talking about, sort of the globalization of AI, the democratization of AI, and how it'll be customized for the different settings. Let's say in India, a Brazil, a UAE, in Indonesia compared to the US, Germany, places like this. I think in lower income countries, I think what you'll see is like the quality of a service. Let's suppose you're looking at sort of a medical care, right? It may vary widely between sort of a richer country and a lower income country. I think when you think about the value of intelligence that we're providing through, let's say, ChatGPT, that could be have more parity. And that's an interesting thing I think to look at in research. It's something I'm interested in exploring.
Yeah, it's such a cool data set, and kudos for putting it out there. I have one final question for you.
Yeah,
It's a weird one.
no worries.
Um, so what dead economist do you think would be best at your job?
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. So I think John Kenneth Galbraith is like someone
Oh,
that
wow. Interesting. Okay.
I really resonate with his career. When my dad is an economist, when my dad was in graduate school, they read John Kenneth Galbraith's work. And of course, it's different than what we would do today in grad school or what I did when I was doing my PhD. But I always felt that having this broad view of what economics was and how it could be leveraged. And of course, he was ambassador to India and other roles in his life.
Yeah.
He was really the consummate sort of Renaissance person back in those days who was able to take economics from the ivory tower into sort of other settings and really make a difference. And I felt like AI is just too big of a topic, too big of a phenomenon, too important of a technology to just be confined in an academic setting or one lab. I feel like someone like John Kenneth Galbraith may be really sort of the broadest possible human who studied economics and really made it work. And that I think is what required in our job, where I feel like I have to be responsive to internal colleagues who are really excited about the economics piece, external stakeholders in enterprise and government, technologists who are interested to see how the world is changing. And it's all wrapped up in the broader context of a changing economy and society. And I think his career and work is indicative of his ability to navigate those kinds of trade-offs and really speak to the widest possible audience.
Yeah, that's a good answer.
I
Cool.
didn't. I wasn't ready for it, but I loved it.
Yeah,
I was
no,
thinking that's someone I really resonate with.
that's awesome. Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for being part of the show. And to any listeners, check out Ronnie's research now on Substack, as you know.
Thank you very much.
So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
The Economics of Work is brought to you by Revelio Labs, workforce data for research and benchmarking. If you enjoyed, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. It'll help us reach other curious listeners. I'm your host, Ben Zweig. Our producer is Cole Wagner. Thanks for listening.